Hello and Happy New Year. Colin here with another reading from my novel Short Mercy, which is available wherever you get books. I've already recorded a video where I read chapter 1. That was posted just before Christmas. In that chapter, we meet the embattled lead, Jim Short, who runs this tiny little struggling bookstore in the small town of Heathering, Nova Scotia. And we discover in the first chapter that on a quiet Friday night, a foggy evening, he was robbed for just over $1,000, and he's filed a police report. And people in town, as we're led to believe in the first chapter, are likely to suspect it's the doing of infamous mythic outlaw W.J. Mercy. And so in chapter 2, we're going to be introduced to W.J. Mercy. Actually, this was the first nugget of an idea for this book. I initially thought I was going to write a Western, and I thought if I'm going to try and create a character who's like the quintessence of a mythic bank robber, he really needs to have a cool name, and I landed on W.J. Mercy. And so in chapter 2, we're going to learn a little bit about that myth and what compels people about Heathering. This is what the book looks like. It would mean a whole lot to me if you sought it out as a winter read. It's available obviously on Amazon and in local bookstores around the Maritimes. You can also find all those links at my website, which is colinsweets.com. This is chapter 2 of Short Mercy. W.J. Mercy almost surely didn't exist. Or perhaps like other wondrous figures of myth, a man who called himself W.J. had once existed, but the communal development of his story had been so patchworked over the ages, there was no way to tell what was and wasn't true. Per the buzz, he was a classic outlaw, and the only one known so widely through eastern Canada. A sort of northern Jesse James for the modern age, known for two traits above all else: evasiveness and clemency. He'd never been caught, and so the legend lived on. He'd never killed, and so the legend's joy remained uncompromising. If W.J. had been known as a killer, his myth would have been tarnished by spots of tragedy. Instead, kids could play cops and W.J. Mercy on the playground, and moms and dads could read about him in the paper and chuckle about his nerve, all the while critiquing the hapless efforts of leather notebook-having law enforcement to bring him down. It was not unusual for the uninhibited to admit a backward respect for W.J. "You've got to hand it to him," they'd say. "He gets what he wants every time. He just takes it, and no one gets hurt." Invariably, someone would take on the righteous defense. "They do get hurt. Perhaps not physically, but he robs people of their livelihood and pride." It's a fair point, though such a killjoy. The reputation was born in 1978, when every major bank on Cape Breton Island was robbed within 18 hours by a man in a black mask. The name was derived from a piece of cardstock recovered at one of the crime scenes, which was imprinted with the letters W.J. in crisp Smith Corona typeface. To commit a crime of this scale on an island of all places was bold, but the assailant's style is what caught the public's attention. By the robbery of the fifth bank, the RCMP presumed to have detected a geographical pattern and lined the Cabot Trail with squad vehicles. By the eighth bank, they got word that getaway cars had been different each time, save one detail: they were all black. And so they started doing random highway spot checks on black vehicles. By the 12th bank, they realized there was in fact no pattern, and that the bandit appeared to be popping up in an entirely arbitrary sequence, so all teller banks on Cape Breton were ordered to lock their doors. By the time the doors were locked, all but one bank had been robbed, and W.J. just so happened to be inside that bank already. He tossed a sack on his shoulder and walked casually like a guerrilla Santa Claus toward the locked door, where he kindly asked the security guard to unlatch it for him. The guard glared at the featureless black fabric and weighed the threat of his club against that of the not yet raised Beretta in the crook's left hand, and in a moment reached to unlock the door and slid it open manually. W.J. walked outside and was gone again. His calm demeanor and the fact that he was never met with resistance became the heart of the story. Witnesses spoke of how they never even felt especially frightened. He'd scarcely addressed anyone directly. He'd used his manners. His gun never went off. He'd managed to single-handedly commit the grand theft of $180,000 without ever having to provoke fear, force, or fatality. It was his positive trait for which the horrific incident became known, his mercy. All through Nova Scotia, eventually the rest of the Maritimes, and ultimately the country, his name became synonymous with that same quarter, the moments when life spares you the worst-case scenario. When a man would manage to make it home safely in a menacing blizzard, his wife would tell him, "You had WJ's mercy." And when teachers would surprise their students with a pop quiz and the students fared reasonably well, the teacher would say, "Must be WJ's mercy." And before long, WJ's mercy became the legend's full name, W.J. Mercy, like the pseudonym of an author of tawdry romance found in the back right-hand corner of A Word With You in Heathering, Nova Scotia. But where there remains mystery, there breeds conflation. The unsolved case of W.J. Mercy's sensational bank heist invited other petty thieves to use his name as their scapegoat. Soon the entire Atlantic underbelly was buying up cardstock and stamping it with the letters W.J. In time, every non-violent robbery for decades would be attributed to W.J. Mercy until the time it was solved, at which point the narrative would scrub his involvement so to preserve the legend, and the fantasy might still be out there, outsmarting. As a result, it became impossible to know for certain which crimes were W.J. Mercy's and which were that of some wannabe. And though it's difficult to imagine such an adept crook as W.J. never stealing again, most police insisted the tales were tall and that one shouldn't lend them too much credence. A lady whose cat had run away from home would ask, "Do you think W.J. Mercy stole my mittens?" And the officer would say, "No, ma'am, there's no such person, just a bunch of stories." 40 years after the original legendary heist, Jim Short couldn't help but point out the obvious in reference to his own black-masked thief. However much it troubled him to be lumped in among wailing cat ladies. "We'll call you if anything comes up overnight, Jim," said Officer Todd, closing his notebook. "But I'll be honest, these things are usually pretty hard to track." "Todd, you don't suppose it was W.J. Mercy?" said Jim, feeling a bit silly. "In my little store of all places." "No, Jim," said Officer Todd. "That's just a bunch of stories." And that's the end of Chapter 2. If you want to read my little story, it's called Short Mercy. As I said, the links are at colinsweets.com, or you can just head to your store. I hope you're having a good start to your new year and that you're staying safe. We'll see you around.